So one of the most rewarding parts of this YouTube channel is when I receive emails and comments about the videos that I make. And I recently received an email about the last video that I made trying to explain how we can make Hawaii a better place. Because I thought the email was great, and with permission from the individual, I'd like to share some of the points that that individual brought up about life in Hawaii. And I hope that by the end of this video, you get a couple of things. The first is an understanding of how Hawaii may be viewed by someone who is outside of Hawaii, because sometimes it's hard to tell how things are when you're living in the snow globe. And a second thing is a response to that criticism from a local who's not going to get defensive, because sometimes when people talk about Hawaii and we don't like what they say, sometimes we can act, like that. So the individual brought up 9 points, and I want to just address and respond to each of their criticisms. And again, I just want to say thank you to the person for letting me share. All right, so here we go. I mentioned casually the other day that I researched living in Hawaii and determined that despite being a beautiful place with what seems to be a nice culture, it's too much of a mess. Let me tell you some of the things that make it impossible for me to seriously consider living in Hawaii. So let's stop right there. First, I think that it's great that this person looked into living into Hawaii and didn't just go based on what they see on social media or in marketing or advertising or on television shows. Because that's one of the biggest mistakes I see a lot of people do, is when they think they want to move to Hawaii, they just go for it. You might want to take some time to actually look how life in Hawaii is. And I hope that this channel can provide some insight into that. And the second thing that I want to bring up that's sort of meta about this whole conversation is, who can talk about what life in Hawaii is like? Can only locals talk about how life is here? And if anybody else tries to talk about it, do we try to shut down those voices because they just don't understand? And some people might say, especially some local people might say, if you don't know what you're talking about, no talk, right? Or something like that, where they just don't want to hear what other people have to say because they, in their minds, think they're not qualified to understand the culture, how things are in Hawaii. Just speaking for myself, I don't agree with that. I think that if you put the time into researching what life is really like in Hawaii, I think that you should have an opinion, and it's okay to express that opinion. Now, I think it's important to also identify to the audience where your background is. So if you're not from Hawaii, I think it's okay to put that up front. And if you are from Hawaii, I think you should mention that as well. So first, the baseline generalization I've come to have is that it's like Hawaii looked at everything Singapore did in the 1960s to become the envy of the modern world and did the exact opposite. Their tax strategy repels business and investment. Their public education system is one of the worst in the nation for a variety of reasons. The economy is completely reliant on tourism with very little economic diversification, and these problems are all interconnected. Their government policies are like someone studied the failures of California's policies like it was a class in what to do instead of what to avoid, and then implemented a B student version of these policies. So the first time I actually read this, I had a pretty good laugh. Like, just kind of hearing how it is from someone, like not sugarcoating it, it's funny in its own way. So I think it's a hard comparison to compare a country like Singapore to Hawaii, although maybe there are some equivalents in terms of population or landmass or other things. It's just hard to make that comparison and expect a place like Hawaii to incorporate everything that a country like Singapore has. Now, talking about taxes, as someone who has to self-report taxes for this YouTube channel, it's challenging, and I dread it every single time. I put it off to like the last possible day or two before it's due. I don't know why I do that. I think it's because it's just so challenging sometimes. In fact, I had to call the Department of Taxation to help me because I didn't understand why there was this carryover balance every single year. Now, education and economic diversification are referenced later in the email, so I'll talk about that later. But they did mention interconnected in terms of all the problems, and I agree that a lot of the problems here in Hawaii are interconnected, and it's hard to escape that because it's such a small place. And I think that's why it makes solving any particular problem very difficult, because it gets tangled with everything else that we have going on. And I'm not sure about the failures of California, but I thought that the analogy to a B student was pretty funny. The cost of living is beyond unreasonable. It's higher than New York and San Francisco when you factor in the inflated cost of food and other things. Living in Hawaii is maybe 30% better in terms of natural beauty than Florida, but it costs 300% as much. Just speaking as a local, I don't know if the cost of living has gotten to the point of being unreasonable. It's definitely high, but I think that point of it being unreasonable is different for everyone. And we are seeing a lot of people make that choice where it's not worth it anymore. But in terms of it being unreasonable, I'm not sure we've reached that point yet. And whenever I see a subjective percentage like 30% better, how do you quantify how much more beautiful something is than another? But I do get the idea that the cost of living is a lot higher than places like Florida. Taxes are also ridiculous, and near as I can tell, the only benefit from those inflated tax dollars is a relatively strong healthcare subsidy. Every other public service is comparable to Florida or worse, and even the healthcare isn't better by much of a margin. 11% individual tax rate compared to 0% in Florida. Just nuts. And as we'll get to later on, all that money is really going to welfare programs for people who've been left behind by the rising cost of living. When it comes to taxes in Hawaii, it can be challenging. I didn't know too much about income taxes until I actually started to do my own taxes, and I realized what the different tax brackets are. That middle tax bracket is pretty wide, but of course I got married and now I have a son, so it does kind of help, but still, I get it. The taxes can be pretty high. And when it comes to healthcare and social services, I do agree that Hawaii does spend a lot. MedQuest provides access to healthcare for low-income adults and children, and it's important because healthcare is hard to come by. We have limited doctors and nurses, especially now with everything going on. Speaking for my family, I'm glad that we don't need to rely on that, but I'm glad that it's there for people who need it. Not only are rents and real estate prices outrageous with outdated, tiny, dilapidated one-bedroom condos built in the 1950s, priced around $700,000 with insane HOA fees, not wrong there. Most properties in Hawaii are purchased as leasehold agreements, which means you don't own the property, you own an agreement to sublet the property for a period of usually 100 years. This means most property in Hawaii can't be held in appreciation or passed down as a form of generational wealth. Property in Hawaii, unless you find a rare fee simple property, is a depreciating asset. Now, while I do agree that a lot of the condos and a lot of the houses were built back in the 70s, 60s, 70s, I don't agree that most of the properties here are leasehold. In fact, I think the majority of the properties here are fee simple. And as the person mentioned here, leaseholds are sort of like subletting property for a certain amount of time. And I know it's something that a lot of people from the mainland have no idea about, and it's something that they should be aware of if they're looking to buy a property in Hawaii. Because sometimes new buyers, they just see the low price and they just go for it, right? And they don't think about whether it's leasehold or fee simple. They just see the price and they're just so excited to buy. And so just some quick advice, if you see a property and it's really low and it just seems too good to be true, you might want to hold off and ask whether this is a leasehold or fee simple, because chances are it's a leasehold. So rent-wise, what would cost $2,000 in Orlando, Tampa, or St. Pete would cost $4,500 plus in Hawaii. And that's not even mentioning other monthly expenses. Food is 30 to 50% more, electricity is more, internet is more. Average cost of eating out in Hawaii hovers around $25 to $30 for a sit-down meal. Even if you can afford those prices, no one who's responsible with money will be able to justify paying 3 times as much for 30% better quality of life. And that 30% is generous. I'd argue it's much less unless you're very outdoorsy, because the quality of housing is much lower. So I'm not familiar with the rent prices out in Florida, but I can speak for the rent prices here in Hawaii, on Oahu, in Honolulu. I think the 4,500 plus is a bit high. I would say you probably could find something nice, maybe a 2-bedroom for 2,500 to 3,500, which is still high. I'm not saying that's cheap, but I don't think it's 4,500 plus unless you're looking specifically at some of these luxury condos in Kaka'ako. And I do agree that food, electricity, internet, the most expensive in the country. And in terms of lowering costs for those things, I don't think it's gonna happen unless we start growing more of our own food, producing cleaner energy at a cheaper price, or just improving our broadband infrastructure. And again, I'd say it's really hard to quantify whether it's 30% 100% better than any other place in the world. I agree though that if you like the outdoors, Hawaii is a great place, especially if you live in a place like Kauai. But I think even people who like the outdoors, after a while, it kind of starts to lose its charm. So this is my favorite part, the education. Their public education system makes raising children there, outside of private schools, incredibly risky. There are a variety of factors that cause this. First, obviously, is that the public school system is largely a daycare masquerading as a school system nationwide. More specifically to Hawaii, however, a lot of the students disengage early because they know that in Hawaii's woefully undiversified economy, they are likely to end up working in front-facing hospitality and consumer retail jobs related to tourism. Teacher retention there is also a huge problem because the teacher's salary doesn't come close to the cost of living in Hawaii. Teachers in Hawaii are significantly below the poverty line and have to rely on government assistance, which is of limited availability and usually prioritizes long-term residents and locals, not teachers who have to be shipped in from the mainland. So first, I've never heard anyone talk about sending their kid to public school as incredibly risky, but I did laugh at that part. And I laughed because it's kind of true, that people and parents will sacrifice so much so that their kids don't have to go to public school, as if that's the worst thing you could do as a parent. Now, as to the comment about whether students disengage early in school because they're just gonna end up at a hotel or retail, I don't know if that's true or not. Just speaking for myself, I honestly never even thought about that growing up here. I just wanted to get out of school and go to college, and then at that point figure out what I wanted to do with my life. Because I think education has a lot to do with the parents. And if kids are disengaging at a young age, like was being said here, then I think that's more on the parents and the type of parents that we have growing up here. Now, the teacher retention issue is something that I absolutely agree on. I mentioned this in a previous video that Hawaii only sees 50% of its teachers after 5 years. So half of them are quitting within 5 years of being a teacher, and that's hard. And yes, we are importing teachers from the mainland and other places to teach here. But it's just too bad that we don't have more local teachers. I have nothing against bringing in teachers from the mainland. In fact, I think that's a good idea because it's gonna expose local kids to other perspectives, mainland perspectives, other different places in the country. And I think that's good for them to be exposed to that. But I also think it's critical for our education system to improve and to become, I guess, more stable by growing our own teachers here, like having local teachers here. And the way that you do that is by having kids see local teachers succeed and they become inspired to become teachers just like what they see. But I love talking about education, but we gotta move on. Okay, let's talk about racial tension and animus on the islands, because as much as the narrative of the Aloha spirit is alive, the internet is crawling with video footage of racially motivated violence, like school bullying and general lingering resentment regarding the US occupation of Hawaii. And the idea of moving to a place where you'll at the very least get lectured by strangers randomly about social justice and more likely be involved in instances of real unprovoked racial hostility is basically a deal breaker. This doesn't affect Mark Zuckerberg or the rich retirees in Maui. There's a lot of them there. But the average lower middle class Hawaiian, which is most Hawaiians, relies on a system of cultural and family support for job networking, sharing property, etc., which is a closed off xenophobic system. Understandably or not, huge turnoff. So there's a lot that was said in this, and I made a video about racial tension and race and all that. It's on my channel. And so if you're interested in that, you can go check out that video. But what I will say is that it's hard to disagree with a lot that was said here. I wish I could disagree with it and say that's absolutely false, but as a local who grew up here and kind of knows how our culture is, yeah, I would say that's a pretty good generalization about how things are. I never experienced any bullying growing up. Again, I'm Japanese. Also, I'm not that tall, but I never experienced that growing up. But I do know kids that did, and that's terrible. And yeah, it's often based on race. Also want to point out that not everyone in Hawaii is Hawaiian. Hawaiian usually refers to native Hawaiian, whereas if you're like from Hawaii, you live Hawaii, you're just a local, you're just from Hawaii. And I agree that a lot of the local culture relies on favors, on who you know, on favoritism. That's how we survive in a lot of ways. And that's not to say that that's right. it's unfair, but that's a really good reason why I think a lot of people should figure out whether they want to come to Hawaii and move here, knowing that that's how things can be. Because if you come to Hawaii and you know no one, you're gonna have a lot harder time making those connections and getting those deals or whatever, like those promotions or those jobs, because you don't know anyone, right? So you're gonna have to commit to spending a lot of time here, and you may go your entire life without building that network. But if you have kids who will then have grown up in Hawaii, they'll know a lot of people, and for them, they're gonna take advantage of that network later. The homelessness issue in Hawaii is somehow worse than LA. Homelessness is rampant there, and it's increasing, and it's made worse by the fact that if you go broke in Hawaii or you YOLO your last dollar on a plane ticket to paradise, you can't escape with a bus ride. You've got to pony up for a flight out. Now, I don't know if the homelessness situation is worse than LA. I know per capita, we're, I think, second worst. We've been worse for the worst state for a while, but we might be second worst now per capita. Also, it's not really a competition that I want Hawaii to be in with other states. Like, I don't want us to compete for the worst state for homelessness. In a lot of ways, I wish that visitors would speak up about it, because locals have, because they're in some places where locals live, but they're also in places where visitors go. And I think if the visitors spoke up about it a little bit more, maybe that might put some pressure to get things done. And that's completely unfair to ask visitors to say that kind of stuff and bring that stuff up. It's not their home, right? But it's a hard issue to figure out. And I wish that I had a good solution to how to address it, but I just don't at this time. Okay, the economy is over-reliant on tourism and doesn't have the educational focus to shift away from that over-reliance in any serious way, even though it would solve a ton of problems there. No promotion or training for high-tech ag to reduce food prices and decrease reliance on net imports of agricultural products. In fact, there seems to be a resistance to any of those things, because any outside ideas or outside help seem to represent paternalistic colonialism to the most influential parts of the populace. Unfortunately, while the intention is punishment, it's a bit of a self-own, because in practice, that's just anti-intellectualism. Even though they don't teach these future technologies and don't do a good job teaching current subjects, you better believe they teach everyone about race and the history of colonialism, which again is kind of whatever, but you can't fix your current housing crisis by protesting the events of 80 years ago. That's therapy, not problem solving. Okay, last to unpack here. Lot of good stuff. Now, I don't know if the resistance to new ideas or outside ideas has anything to do with colonialism. I personally don't think it has anything to do with that. I think it's just about island mentality. When you grow up and when you live in a place that's so isolated, you just do things just cause, right? Because the thing is, if things are working out fine, no sense change it. And if things aren't working out fine, well, people just tolerate it. I'm not saying that's a good thing. I just think that that's how things are in Hawaii. And in terms about teaching about race and colonialism, I think that's more of an individual home thing. I don't think everyone has that. Speaking for myself, I didn't learn about any of that at home in terms of the colonialism part. That was something that I learned through Hawaiiana class. But I do think that it is taught in certain homes. And the challenging thing about that is when it's taught in homes, it's very informal, and I think that's what makes it so perpetual, right? It's hard to identify because it happens on a day-to-day, very subtly throughout the person's life as they're growing up, and then they have that ideology, and then when they become adults, that's what they pass on as well. All right, so a couple more. Then there's traffic. Traffic on Oahu is recorded as the worst in the country, even worse than LA, and for exactly the same reasons. The lower class and lower middle class workers who work in Honolulu live elsewhere on the island because they can't afford the metropolitan prices that trust fund kids pretending to be hippies pay to live lavishly around Waikiki, so they all commute in at the same time on just a few main roads. Since zoning and regulatory restrictions prevent any new affordable housing from being built, the commute problem can't be solved. So they try to solve it by building high-speed rail, which turns out, again, just like California, to be not only a day late and $1 short, but an endless boondoggle of funding being used as a government slush fund and constant project delays and price increases. Now, traffic is really bad on Oahu. I'm sure it's bad in other places across the state, but it's particularly bad here on Oahu. I'm thankful that for the past 5 years, I just walk to work. I don't have to drive anymore. But when I did drive, it would be about 35 minutes into work, but I had to leave like before 6 o'clock in the morning. And then after work, if I left right after work, it'd take me 45 minutes to maybe an hour. And of course, if it rains, just add on another 15 to 20 minutes. But I do think that commuting affects your quality of life. And I was talking to my wife the other day about this, that if you had to make the choice whether you lived in a bigger place but further away or a smaller place but closer to work, which one would you choose? And for me, I would choose the closer to work, because being closer to work, it just makes it so much easier. I feel like I save so much time. There are people who drive an hour plus into town and then they drive an hour plus out of town. And yeah, you can use that time to listen to audiobooks or do other things, but to me, just having my commute be so short, I feel like I can do so much more throughout the week, and those hours, they add up. And in terms of rail, well, we all know how that's going. And to close, the thing is, most people seem to experience Hawaii through the lens of A, vacations, B, tourism advertising, and C, Instagram influencers who are incentivized to make you envy their lifestyle, and also are mostly trust fund rich kids whose lives you could never attain anywhere because their daddy bought them their first Maserati when they were 14. But even despite all those horrific problems that are impossible to overlook, I still would consider Hawaii as a place to live. The natural beauty is amazing. I like the laid back culture, and I like the popularity of mopeds there because driving a car is whack. Each one of those problems individually is a deal breaker, and there are I'm not gonna go back and count, but probably like 5 or 6 of them. And that's just a list of deal breakers, not even just more general cons. Now, I do agree that Hawaii is often glamorized through a very strange lens. It's tourism, so of course you're going to see the best of everything. Beautiful beaches, food, shopping, just this glamorous lifestyle that honestly, I don't know who lives that lifestyle if they actually live and work here. Well, they can live here, but work here, I don't know too many people that have time for that lifestyle. I don't pay much attention to Instagram influencers, so I have no idea what image they're projecting, but I do see some YouTubers out there, and when I watch their videos, I'm surprised about where they're talking about, because it seems so different to me. And despite all of the issues that were discussed, I still think Hawaii's a great place to live. And I really appreciate the opportunity to share this email with you. I learned a lot about what someone outside of Hawaii thinks about Hawaii, because like I said before, sometimes it's hard to be so self-aware as a state, like how other people actually see you. And while I may not agree with all of the points that were brought up, I agree with many of them, and I think that they're spot on, particularly for someone who is not from Hawaii. So let me know what you think in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and aloha.
Hello.